Welcome to our discussion about Syria, 1 year after the fall of Assad. As many of you know, Marie Colvin was killed by the Assad regime in 2012, and we honor her legacy as a foreign correspondent here at the Marie Colvin Center at Stony Brook University. A year ago, on December the 8th, 2024, Assad fled in disgrace to Moscow. The regime, which had lasted for 50 years with his father and then son, just collapsed overnight. And he was replaced by the rebel commander, now President Ahmed al-Sharaa. What's life like for Syrians under Ahmed al-Sharaa? How are they faring 1 year on? So I'm Sarah Baxter. I'm director of the Colvin Center, and we have two very distinguished journalists here with us today. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Asmaa al-Omar, who writes for the Wall Street Journal and many other publications. She's written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, and she was very recently a Reuters Institute Fellow at Oxford University. And we also have Oliver Marsden, who has written many times on Syria and the Middle East for the Sunday Times, which was Marie Colvin's old newspaper. And he's just joined the Observer in the UK as its Middle East correspondent. And he joins us from Beirut. So Asmaa, I'm going to start with you. Just what did it feel like? Take us back to those days running up to December the 8th, really this period exactly 1 year ago, as the Assad regime suddenly appeared very fragile, and then he was gone. The dictator was toppled.
Yeah. Well, thank you, first of all, Sarah, for having us. This is a great opportunity. It still feels surreal. I think it's been a year now. But while it was happening after HTS had announced they started the operation, I think most of us were in complete disbelief. We couldn't believe that this is even possible. And I think part of me was whenever I would have conversations with people, I'd be like, no, this is obviously, it's not going to happen. And I had like a lot of, I guess, worries about what that would mean. And I think a lot of time when you're faced with a vague future, it's harder for you to accept that something new is changing and what that might be like. And to be fair, even like the months leading up to that, we've been hearing about news from Idlib, from the north, where HTS has had its power, about a big thing happening, and we just sort of we kind of said like, no, like this is, I don't think it's going to work, and we were not taking it really seriously. But around 2022, I mean, Sarah, we were like still writing news about how Assad had taken power completely over and how they were planning to take even control of the rebel areas. So this was really, really far-fetched. So it was a shock for all of us, like us who like watch Syria, monitor Syria, write on Syria.
Yeah, Oliver, you're one of those who watch, write, monitor Syria. At the time, of course, it was practically impossible to report inside the country, for many years after Marie's death. Tell us a bit about HTS. Because Asmaa was mentioning HTS, but it wasn't particularly well known outside Syria. But this is the group that spawned the current president, isn't it?
Exactly. I mean, HTS, Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham, it was born, I guess, out of Ahmed al-Sharaa leaving Iraq, being asked by Baghdadi to set up al-Qaeda's outpost in Syria, which then morphed into al-Nusra Front, and then it was Jabhat al-Fatah al-Sham, I believe, and then it morphed into HTS. And as Asmaa said, before I go on, I think it's important to say that Ahmed al-Sharaa actually broke ties with al-Qaeda and didn't agree with Baghdadi, and then it was through that breaking of ties that eventually HTS came about. And as Asmaa said, its base, its stronghold was Idlib. It was getting support, I think, from Turkey. And like Asmaa said, there were rumblings of what was happening. And I think it's sort of important to mention that it's interesting, it came at the time with as the war in Lebanon between Israel and Lebanon was happening, because what that had done was crippled Hezbollah. It had really crippled them and their networks within Syria. So when at the time I was in Lebanon, having I think the ceasefire was announced on 27th of November last year, and this was all starting to happen around that time. And I, like Asmaa, was like, I'm not sure what's happening here. I can't really believe this is happening. And also, if something is going to happen, it's going to take a long time. Assad was strong, or we thought, Asmaa was strong at that point. I thought he was like, right, he's in power for a long time now. But it happened very quickly, and the fall of Assad happened very quickly. And I do think a good chunk of that has to do with the weakening of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and therefore the weakening of Hezbollah within Syria. And they were really propping up Assad, and they were, sort of strong opponents of HTS. And so that all of these different things happening geopolitically, Turkey backing, I'm sure America has some sort of, sway, or they were in contact with al-Shara. So it all happened very quickly at a very important time. So yes,
yeah,
it's amazing to see.
For Americans, it was absolutely stunning to see that a former al-Qaeda jihadist was suddenly running Syria, and yet seemed like the good guy in here. I mean, it was a real turnaround, and he's since been welcomed 3 times to meet President Trump. So Syria has been through an extraordinary turn. Asmaa, what's the feeling like, just among friends, family, etc., about the new Syria? And, obviously they must have felt excited, elated, and incredibly apprehensive. But how has that mood developed?
Right, as you mentioned, I think everyone was very excited, and this is something that we've not imagined was ever going to happen. So the main feeling was surprise, was shock, and I think Syrians started instantly pondering a lot of questions, like, should we return? Should we stay abroad? Like, what does this mean to us as people, as diasporas, as people inside, like people within Syria who were displaced inside of Syria started moving back to their cities. You could now travel from one part to another in Syria without being stopped. Obviously, not all areas in Syria have full security now. There's still a lot of problems, but just in comparison with how it was just a year before, it's incredibly changed. And soon after, sadly, because Syria is such a complicated issue and a complicated file, instantly you started discussing bigger issues, and a lot of things came on the table, whether it's women's freedoms, minorities, all the other issues, how are we going to build a government, who's going to be in the government, who's going to represent Syrians. And in the past 15 years, sadly, Syria has been segregated into many different I want to say maybe based on ideologies, political leanings, really, really segregated. And this is something that has not been necessarily a part of what Syria was before 2011. It was more homogenous and things were much, much, much different. But now we have the questions of, okay, how are we going to deal with all of this change? How are we going to come together to heal after the war? And people have different wounds. Some people lost homes. Maybe other people who were from Damascus didn't really have that issue. They were able to come back to a still standing house, let's say. But a lot of people don't have money to rebuild. The government still doesn't have money to rebuild. So very overwhelming, I want to say, still in disbelief, but lots of stuff to discuss, lots of stuff to do. Yeah.
So Oliver, both Asmaa and I were talking, we were very struck by a piece you wrote about Syrians visiting the beach. And that sort of sense of freedom symbolized by the sea and just relaxing at the on a day off like that, and yet against this backdrop that's still very uncertain. You were recently in Syria. What did you observe there?
It's interesting. Yeah, speaking about the piece, it was kind of the way of looking at the coast and what was particularly before maybe an Alawite heartland, which the kind of religious group that the Assad family belonged to. I use that sort of as a microcosm to look at the wider structure of Syria, and what I found is that it's very much, you know, a place in a state of flux, but that also applies to, I think, people's feeling of safety and freedom. You know, there's the people from Idlib who in the past couldn't get to the coast, couldn't get to Tartus and Latakia. They're able to get there now. When I was there are all these big, you know, SUVs turning up with Idlib number plates, and even in Tartus, when Ahmad al-Shara spoke at the UN General Assembly, people were waving flags, and there were some Islamic al-Liwa white flags being waved, which, you know, some of the community in Tartus said that would never have happened before. It was much more kind of secular. And so there's this sort of feeling of those who couldn't move around freely before can, and maybe certain communities that felt a bit more protected from the war, maybe could move around a bit freely, are now feeling a little bit nervous, especially on the coast. And then if you kind of zoom out, you know, you have that all over the country where, as Asmaa said, you can kind of drive around much more freely now. It's much safer. Obviously, you can't get into the northeast without permissions from the Kurds, but you know, then there are sort of communities like the Druze in the south, maybe the Alawites in the west, that are feeling, you know, that Syria is free, but they're a bit apprehensive now because there's a new government. It's a big change, and belief-wise, it's a big change. So there's this sort of feeling of there's a lot of apprehension on the ground, is what I felt.
Yeah, so al-Shara is from the Sunni majority, I believe, in Syria, and which had been kind of kept repressed, I think, under Assad. Now that they're in the majority, are they feeling empowered, and how are they dealing with their new role as the leading force in Syria? Because, of course, as you said, Asmaa, it's such a mosaic of different communities, Alawite, Druze, Bedouin, all of whom were at one point perhaps relying on Assad for some kind of protection. And yet al-Shara does seem to be broadcasting an inclusive message. It doesn't always get through, though, does it?
Yeah, no. And I think this has been, I think the new government and al-Shara has, like, they knew that this was going to be a big issue to deal with from the beginning, like knowing how to handle minorities and how to handle the speech around this, because it was very sensitive time as well. And any word that would be said in the wrong context could start a civil war, because the country was already, like, things were very unstable back then. And I want to say it's still very much the case. And we've seen how on the coast in Latakia, we had the clashes with the Alawite minority back like early 2025, and that was very bloody. And it turned out against. I think the government didn't like expect that the issue would become so much bloody, but the clashes between the government and the Alawites there was really bad, and because of that, a lot of Alawites like had to leave and go to Lebanon or try to seek to leave the country in another way. And then not too soon after that, the clashes also between the government and the Druze minorities in the south also took off. And it's still an issue, and I don't know how the government is planning to handle this now. There is I think all Syrians are very familiar with how the previous government and like the Bashar government had painted sectarian conflict and how it basically relied on that to stay in power. And now it's very interesting to see that, you know, this could go in a very wrong way if the speech and the government emphasized on the Sunni speech as opposed to a very inclusive speech. And like if you go and talk to people, there's a lot of, you know, we've liberated Syria and this is our time to take over now. And the country was not under our control for 50 years. And, you know, why not? Why not give us the rule now? And
yeah. So Oliver, you recently made an interesting film about al-Shara, his background. You went and spoke to his, people who knew him from when he was a boy all the way to the man that he's become, the president, that he's effectively a world leader now. So tell us about al-Sharaa, the man, not just the president, and whether Syrians feel he's somebody who can be trusted.
Well, as far as being trusted, I think a lot of the Sunni community feel that he can be trusted, and a lot of other communities. But they're definitely amongst some of the Druze, some of the young women I spoke to in Damascus, and other communities. They still don't trust him, and the Alawite community, they don't trust him. They need to see results. They just don't want to trust him blindly. They need to see something. And what the problem, as Asmaa said, there's a flare-up of violence on the coast, a flare-up of violence in the south. There's been, a little bit of clashes up in the northeast with the Kurds. And so for them, it's like, well, we're happy that there's a new Syria and we're happy this guy is in charge, but we need to see some results. And so they felt they haven't seen that. As far as for the man himself, it's so difficult. I mean, we spoke to a few people from his past, as you say, and everyone talks about this shy, quiet guy who grew up in Damascus, quite pious. His father was a pan-Arab nationalist, an intellectual, went to work in Saudi, was sort of kicked out of Syria for a bit. Anyway, then came back, and his mother was a teacher, but he was, more religious than his parents, and he was thought of as this, shy, quiet guy. Then he goes off to Iraq, and he sort of joins the resistance against the coalition forces. And then there, I was told, I met a man who fought with him in Iraq, that he built IEDs, and that he didn't just fight for Al-Qaeda. He actually moved around different groups. He was sort of a gun for hire, building IEDs, bombs, roadside bombs and stuff for different groups. And it's interesting, this fighter who fought with him in Iraq talked about how he was trying to unify the factions and that unity was a big thing for him.
Interesting.
Fast forward, you get him back in Syria. And then again, his groups up in the north, they have been accused of crimes and some war crimes and crimes against humanity, allegedly. But later on, as he tried to moderate, I think he understood that he needed to unify the groups. And again, I spoke to a man in Aleppo who kind of was almost like his cameraman, was a journalist who followed him quite closely when he was in HTS up in the north, and talked about, again, how he kind of tried to unify the factions within Syria, and that was a big part of it. And now, as Asmaa said, he is talking about unification and the unified Syria. And so my takeaway is like, it's really hard. When I did sit down and meet him in an interview with The Economist, and he was softly spoken. He was obviously very intelligent. I think he speaks better English than he lets on. And he's shrewd, and he's clever, but I think it's hard to know sometimes what he's thinking. He is this enigma. He is a bit mysterious. People talk about a shy young guy.
Yeah, there was a brilliant kind of origin myth-making story in your film. I wonder what Asmaa made of that at all, because it was obviously a very good olive branch to the US and to the West, because I think part of the myth of how he became more moderate or conciliatory was that he felt that it was better when he was a jihadist in Iraq, it was better to be arrested by the Americans. They treat you better than the Iraqi forces. And this made him rethink his relationship with the US. Do you buy that story? Asmaa, I see you looking somewhat in disbelief there.
I'm not sure I buy it, but I'm intrigued to know what Asmaa says as well.
Oh, I think Iraqis, like, till this day, they're not fond of the current government, so I can see why he would say that now.
Yeah, it's very good PR, isn't it? For if you want to build relationships with the US.
Exactly. I mean, it wasn't. I mean, to be fair, it was also this other Syrian man who fought with him in Iraq who was saying this, and that man isn't on Interpol list and wants to travel, and so I think there are certain agendas, but it is interesting that his relationship, that switch with America, the way he sat down with David Petraeus at the Concordia Summit,
former director of the CIA, a general in Iraq,
And David Trey is saying, I'm a big fan of yours. You know, we used to be on opposing sides. Now I'm a big fan. And then you've got Trump being like, oh yeah, strong guy, attractive guy, and everyone's loving him. And he's like a rock star when he walks onto the UNGA, the UN General Assembly, onto the stage. And so I was there, you know, I was like hearing these things, and I was like, for me, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I definitely came away from that trip in Syria after making that film being like, something happened in American detention that changed a lot. So, I don't know what, and I'm still trying to dig, but like something happened in Iraq when he was in American detention that changed something, because there's a close relationship there that it feels a bit odd.
That's very interesting, because of course he remained on the most wanted list right up to the period when he became president, because events moved so fast. But I do think it you know, whatever else true or not, I think you're probably right that something may have happened to him, because he is extremely good at getting on with Western leaders, and particularly Donald Trump, which takes some doing. I do think Donald Trump likes young handsome leaders. He recently shocked his own supporters by being so flattering to Zoran Mamdani, the new mayor of New York. But I think it's very shrewd of al-Sharaa to court the Americans in that way. Asmaa, are Syrians baffled by this, or do they feel that that's a great sign of progress?
Well, if I can comment on what was being said, we also interviewed with the Wall Street Journal al-Sharaa last year in December, and he also said something that I found interesting, which was that he had been in contact with a lot of governments before he had started the operation, and I'm assuming this contact had lasted for like years. And it's very easy to use the anti-Russia, since like Russia was their biggest enemy, to use the anti-Russia to get a hold on to a lot of Western allies and be like, well, we want to work with you. And a lot of the funding back then was coming from the US and from the West, from Germany, from like donor countries. This money was going to Idlib, and at one point it almost stopped because there were worries about HTS and al-Nusra's rule, and whether they were like too extremist, or were they like moderately extremists, or what was the deal with them. So there was a point where that also was put on hold. And I'm assuming that either it's possible also that back then he was trying to create allies and be like, look, if I do this, if I take over, like, will you back me, like against the Russians, against China, against that sort of axis? And so maybe also something there. But yeah, Syrians were very, very surprised. They were also surprised to see also later al-Sharaa meet with Putin. But it's all very, I think the main impression was that everything was happening so fast, and that al-Sharaa was trying to meet with everyone and have good relations with everyone, and sort of, you know, chase all rabbits at the same time. And he's somehow not so bad at it. He's like been sort of presenting really well internationally. He's like, you know, we're used to presidents who are disappointing, presidents who are, you know, do not really know how to fill a shoe. And this is like a little bit of a new experience. Like, not to say that everyone is like backing this, but I think everyone is like, well, this is very interesting.
Yeah, and so charming as he is, women were apprehensive. You mentioned, Asmaa, when he first came in. How are they feeling life under, you know, a former Sunni rebel commander, a former jihadist, is shaping up in the new Syria?
I think till this day, no big changes have happened. And I want to emphasize that Syria is not just like one, like not every city is the same, and cities are sort of different. The way I think that Sharaa has like not tried to push that file so much yet. I don't think there's like a lot of constant, like they're not really focused on how can we alter the society now. I think they want to keep it as intact as possible, and that includes how they're treating women, or how they're approaching women in media. I think women are mostly apprehensive about him, which is fair, because a lot of the when we were talking about like new constitution in Syria, basically, so we have now an interim constitution, and basically the main, like, I think in the Constitution it was said that the main law that they're relying on is the Sharia law. So this is this naturally will make a lot of people, wonder what's the situation of personal liberties, and including women's liberties, gonna be. I think so far, I don't know if you remember early on in December, there was this spokesperson for the Syrian political administration. He spoke on one TV, and he said that something along the lines of, like, in my opinion, women should not hold a position in X ministry because it's incompatible with their biological and physiological makeup, and they cannot basically fill a role of a man or something like that.
Yeah.
And I was in Syria when that happened, and Syrian women didn't just sit at home and take it. Like, there was a little protest in al-Umayyad Square, and women came out, and we went and we spoke to some of the women then. And they were like, no, we're not going to take this. And women have been, understandably, like, on the front lines, just as they were just as men were in the war. They're a very big part of the civil society. And women do not have the luxury to just sit at home and, like, cover up and not, go out in the workforce and do labor, because also the economy needs them. So, and I think al-Shara also knows Damascus, and he knows that if he was going to do something like that, Damascus is very cosmopolitan. People are not going to take it, and he also started putting his wife in the picture. Like, his wife didn't. I don't think she made any appearance or had any role in Idlib, as far as I remember. But now she's on TV. She's, like, partaking in, like, social initiatives. She's being there, and that, I think that was also maybe a move to say, like, look, we appreciate your role. Maybe it's a little bit limited, and maybe you don't have, like, high positions in the government, but here you still have this.
There's some visibility, yes. And it's interesting that, of course, women felt free to go and protest on the streets. Oliver, what's freedom of the press like? Because for many years after Marie Colvin was killed, journalists just stopped going to Syria unless they were sort of licensed by the Assad regime to go to certain limited locations. It was just too risky. And but now, is the press free? Are there restrictions? What's the situation like?
It's interesting. I think, on December the 8th, as Asmaa, and I know that the doors opened and the floodgates opened. I mean, every single journalist could just walk in easily, and you could cover what you wanted. You could speak to everyone. It was amazing.
Asmaa rummaged through secret police files, I think. That was amazing, really. Yeah. Anyway, you
could do this, and it was amazing. And it was amazing. And then it felt, the opposite. As you said, you had to go on a tour before, you had a minder, all these things in the previous government. Now it's much more open, but things, I probably would never be allowed back in, but I feel that things are slightly changing. There's a lot of bureaucracy now around getting your permissions and what you can do and can't do. I tried to get into Sweden not long after the violence there. And I wasn't allowed in.
That's more of a Druze center, isn't it?
Exactly. Sorry, that's the sort of main city in the south where the Druze community live. And I wanted to get in there after the violence, and there were still some flare-ups of violence. And I was stopped at a checkpoint, and I wasn't allowed in. And I could hear over the kind of radio WhatsApp chat that the guy at the checkpoint was having, and his commander on the other end of the line, and he was saying in Arabic, just tell him anything, just don't let him in, tell him anything. And in the ministries, it's kind of the same. You get sent from one ministry to another. I wanted to do something in a school, actually al-Shara's old high school in Damascus. We wanted to film in there. We had to go to the Ministry of Education to get permission. They took a week to get back to us, and they didn't get back to us. And there's a lot of being sort of sent from pillar to post, and it felt like they were doing that to slow you down and stop you, rather than saying no. They sort of, they didn't want to be rude, or culturally they didn't want to say no, but there are other ways of doing that.
We have to hope that old habits die hard, but if it's something that presages increasing ratchet for the future, then that's very worrying, isn't it?
Well, that's what, as you say. I mean, it started to feel a little bit like the old government. And I don't think they necessarily mean to. And I know that I think certain ministries, the presidential palace and certainly the foreign ministry, they don't love bad press. They kind of sometimes hold a bit of a grudge. So it's starting to feel a little bit, in a very small way, not exactly the same, but a little bit like the previous regime at times. But I think, again, talking about the violence and the flare-ups, I think, I spoke to some Syrians in Damascus who are saying, this isn't going to be like a straightforward process. It's not going to suddenly, wake up one morning and everything's perfect. It's not easy. But I think the government is feeling that maybe they're not catching enough slack, as much slack as they would like, but it's not our job to give them that slack. It's quite the opposite. So they have to sort of get over it. And that's sort of what I think.
Yeah, that's the journalist speaking. Good message there from you, Oliver. There's also, of course, continuing tensions. Asmaa, there's problems with Israel. I mean, Trump just the other day warned Israel to give al-Sharaa some slack, give the new Syria some slack, because he felt that Israel was, which has a border with Syria, was interfering too much and maybe fueling some sectarian divisions. Asmaa, how fearful are Syrians about Israeli involvement?
I think a lot, because it has there's already some bloodshed on the borders with Israel. The minute that the Assad government fell, Israel has made it very clear that whatever treaty that was holding before, it's not the case anymore, and it's not holding anymore. And they're obviously alarmed that a new Sunni, more Sunni government now is in charge. And while they've definitely showed a lot of disdain to Hezbollah and to the Shia militant, who were also, they were very bothered by their presence in Syria, and a lot of times they were targeted during Assad time. Still, that doesn't mean that they're going to be so stoked about the new government. Actually, not too long ago, I think it was last week, Israel has advanced a little bit into one town on the border, and they killed people there. And I think Israel's excuse was, I remember it was something along the lines of, there was a certain Islamist group there, or members of that group that we wanted to target. So that's not great. And when we, again, as I've mentioned, we interviewed Shara last December, and he have made it very clear from the beginning that we don't want Syria to become a launch pad to start any war with neighbors. And I do believe him on that, because I think Syrians do not have the capacity to do that. And despite Israel knowing that, I think the idea of a unified government that's also neighboring them now, it's not great for them. And
yes, so I mean, sometimes they might prefer an unstable rather than a stable Syria. But let me ask you, really, in conclusion, because you've both been brilliant and told us so much. But Oliver, let me ask you first, and then you, Asmaa. I mean, what would a stable, unified Syria mean for the Middle East?
I think it would be hugely beneficial, to put it like an understatement, but I think a unified, stable Syria would help Lebanon, for example, in terms of maybe a return of refugees, right, a return of refugees to Syria. I think it would have such an effect on the Hezbollah-Israel conflict. I think over in Iraq, again, you'd have a similar situation. And Syria is huge, and it could be a real economic powerhouse. And there are so many amazing, incredibly well-educated, brilliant Syrians. And so I think it's not just about the Middle East, it's about the Syrian people and the world. I think it's very beneficial. And I think, as Asmaa spoke about earlier, Israel is very worried about I think a strong unified Syria on its doorstep. I think at the moment for Israel, there's a slight divide and conquer mindset going on. And I think if Syria could be stable and shown, and Israel could believe that it was stable and safe, then it could pave the way for sort of peace in the Middle East, which I say very cautiously, but something like that would be good.
Yes, and Asmaa, as a stable, unified Syria, is that almost too much to hope for? I mean, how would you see it as a Syrian yourself?
Yeah, I do want to be some sort of I want the infrastructure to be okay there. I think the main worry there is people's livelihoods, and I really wish that we can get Syria to be just stable enough so people can have jobs again and can have a functioning economy. Like at one point, and to speak more domestically in the region, Syria became known for producing and exporting drugs, which is insane because this is not how Syrians are, and this is not really, it was never really part of our culture to export amphetamines to neighboring countries. And we've always exported culture, and we exported doctors and education and all of that. And so I think we all long to those days. We all long to the days where Syrians were held in a different light. And I think for maybe most importantly is just to have Syrians' dignity back. And I think that is having a stability is necessary for Syrians, having a government that actually backs them, have their best interest in their mind, all of that. I think this is what's going to be also important to Syrians as individuals and a society as well.
Well, that's wonderful. Asmaa, we hope to host you one day at the Marie Colvin Center. It's been wonderful to have you here remotely with us. And the same for you, Oliver. Thank you so much for your insight and your wisdom and your experience. And I know we all want Syria to succeed and prosper. So thanks for joining us today at the Colvin Center. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.